Okay, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Very nice to see so many people here in the audience for this session. My name is Eric Paglia. I'm the host of the Polar Geopolitics podcast, which is available on all major podcast platforms, Apple and Spotify and so forth. I'm very happy to be moderating a three-part session this afternoon. It's been arranged by the Fridtjof Nansen Institute and the Arctic Frontiers Conference and the Polar Geopolitics podcast. So I have three different sets of two experts discussing various aspects of the future of the Arctic Council. Of course, the Arctic Council turns 30 next year, but in many ways it's never been in a more precarious position than it's been for the past couple of years. So perhaps we can start with you, Jennifer, and you can both, of course, weigh in on this. As an Arctic expert and governance scholar, how unique of an organism is the Arctic Council within this wider ecosystem of global governance? And Rolf, as I mentioned, you can also weigh in as well, because I know you have a lot of experience working with other international organizations such as the UNFCCC.
Yeah, so I think I would start by saying, I was actually drawn to the Arctic as a place for innovative governance. And I think what's important when you think about the Arctic is both the sort of unique combination of really pressing transboundary issues that the Arctic faces, combined with some really innovative governance. And so that's actually what brought me to studying the Arctic and Arctic governance in particular, and the Arctic Council in particular. I think one of the things that's important to remember as we look at the last 2 years is the Arctic Council has evolved over time. In fact, I would go so far as to say when we hit COVID and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were at a period where the Arctic Council was really reflecting on what it was and what it was trying to do, what its mandate was, how it functioned. There were a lot of questions being asked. And like any institution, it was evolving, and there were, and with that were questions. I think that probably what we're seeing right now is much more of a simpler aspiration for the Arctic Council, sort of a coming back to basics, which is really a reflection of sort of where it is, but also where it started, which is its working level, sort of the role that it plays in good policy science interface and on collaboration at the working level, and a depoliticization or an attempt to depoliticize a lot of that, which I think is incredibly important, but also demonstrates one of the unique features relative to other governance institutions, which is its flexibility. I think that the challenges that the Arctic Council faces right now are ones that all multilateral institutions are facing, but they're all adapting in different ways. And what we've seen with the Arctic Council is it really has gone back to trying to go to its grassroots kind of functioning.
Yeah, I would like to fill in. I mean, like you said it, I would really like to emphasize that the Arctic Council existed, was funded before the Arctic Council, was already in 1991. And under those, that was a totally different world. And I know I grew up close to the Russian border, and I kind of, you saw what led up to the collaboration across the border, and you saw, you were aware of those issues that were most relevant, the environmental issues, and kind of saw that take place, and then it evolved, and also, it's just, you said 2 years of turmoil, but you have to remember COVID put a major, it was hampering the work, because, we were not able to collaborate, and in our case, we have more than 800 experts collaborating, or kind of, doing the work for us. So you had to find different ways of getting together. You really had to, focus down on what is your core mandate, what you really have to focus on, and so on. And that was, of course, emphasized even more during the 2 last years, and to really to go down to the basics. But it's also much, it's similar to what you refer to UNFCCC or bodies under the UN system. We're involved with work both of the UNFCCC on climate and IPCC, of course, the Stockholm Convention and Minamata Convention on persistent organic pollutants and mercury and so on. And all of those are based, and UN was based under the same kind of conditions, just following a very restrained or a period of major political challenges. And where you come together you find your common ground, you focus on the topics, and you start development from there. And you kind of, the Arctic Council as it is now is not the Arctic Council that it was in 1991. Neither is UN what it was when it was initiated. So it's kind of similar processes taking place, I would say.
Oh yeah, look back to a lot more about the science policy interface that Jennifer mentioned and some of this cross-border work that you've been very involved with, Rolf, a little bit later. The two of you recently co-authored a paper for the 2023 Arctic Yearbook. It was called What Makes the Arctic and Its Governance Exceptional? Now this, of course, is a year after the invasion of Ukraine, and most analysts had kind of dismissed Arctic exceptionalism after this major event in the Arctic and geopolitics in general. But perhaps you can tell us why you still have some optimism that you see the Arctic still as somewhat exceptional despite all the geopolitics that have been engulfing this region.
Want to start?
Right now, I wish we had Alexander, the third co-author on this paper, here with us, because he has a very beautiful way of saying these things. But I mean, the concept we wanted to grasp is that everything is dynamic, everything is changed, and I'm a natural scientist, and even in my field, I mean, even the Arctic Circle is changing. It's not static. Even the Arctic Circle is moving back and forth due to the inclination of the planet and so on. And we see an Arctic which is on the rapid changes on the ecological side. I mean, we have just, like some years ago, we lost what we call the subarctic zone in Norway, and because it's warming up too much. And we wanted to, to investigate like a cross-cutting concept here, like what can we hold on, and then what is the core of the Arctic in that sense, to what is exceptional for the Arctic, and well, I guess I will hand it over to you from there. And
yeah, I mean, I think ultimately what we need to differentiate is when people sort of dismiss the exceptionalism of the Arctic, and you had sort of two camps, one that it never existed or one that it was dead. But that's sort of limiting it in scope to the geopolitics and assuming that what we're talking about and what's important is the geopolitics of the region. And it's not to dismiss that that's an important element of the peace and cooperation at the political level, but to sort of acknowledge that there's other things that make the Arctic exceptional. And Rolf, obviously, from a natural sciences perspective, was able to do an amazing job of articulating what that meant. And then Edward Alexander, who was our co-author as well, did an amazing job of articulating what it meant from a Gwich'in perspective and what, as a homeland, what does it mean for the Arctic to be a homeland? And I think ultimately what we came out of is Edward provided this analogy of the engine. And so we tried to bring that into the paper and really articulate that if you think of an engine needs fuel, air, and a spark or to function. And so the engine of exceptionalism, the Arctic, is the idea that we bring in different, the fuel being the different knowledges and acknowledging the different knowledge systems, whether it be natural sciences, social sciences, indigenous knowledge, and that what's unique about the Arctic is bringing those knowledges together. Then you need air. And the air, we sort of made the analogy of this is your governance environment and this is your governance approach, and that's another element of the Arctic that has been unique, the norms of governance that we have adopted in terms of bringing in different knowledge systems and trying to bring those into decision making. And then you need the spark, and those are the issues that we're dealing with. And that's probably where there's been the most challenge. But ultimately, you need all of these components to really understand exceptionalism. And I think it does it an injustice to just limit it to the geopolitical perspective.
I think also Ed was, I guess he was the one reminding us that, Arctic as concept is not the native concept, I mean, we just call it home. The Arctic as like the term is from Latin, it's from those from the outside. And that was also what we tried to point to, like there is something inherent there, there's something in there that is not defined by people from the outside. There's something in there that there is some of common interest among indigenous people of the Arctic, among, well, in my case, the joint interest in research, all of those things that are very specific for the Arctic. That is not necessarily, that does not necessarily is reliant on definitions from the outside. Okay,
now without getting too deep into the conceptual level or the sort of academic political science dimension, you are, I guess, a political scientist, Jennifer. The two of you also recently authored another piece where you would talk about the Arctic Council's polycentric governance approach. That sounds a bit technical, but perhaps you can talk a bit about that. And is that one of the fundaments of Arctic, if not exceptionalism, at least some sort of difference amongst other governance organizations in the world?
Well, I'll take. I know. So, true confession: the book chapter just came out, but this is actually something we started co-authoring when I was still working at the Arctic Council. So it's been 4 years, and we made the decision. Actually, we wrote it before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and what we were looking at was the way that the Arctic Council works, and I will not get into the sort of boring academics, but what made it flexible and adaptable, and the idea that through the working groups it had different sort of centers that had some autonomy to work separately, and so you have sort of a balance between centralized governance and decentralized governance. And so we sort of proposed that this was one of the flexibilities that the Arctic Council had. We decided we'd still publish it even in the current context, because I think a lot of those flexibilities become things that we can reflect on now in the current situation. And one of the questions that it brings to bear, which I think is important moving forward, is when you have these decentralized kinds of organizations, what are the mechanisms you have in place for orchestration between the different pieces, and also bridging? And bridging being both across the different working groups, which has always been sort of a challenge for the working groups, is how do you bring a knowledge across the different working groups and avoid them working in silos, but also the bridging vertically between the senior level decision makers and right down to the experts working on very, very specific assessments or projects and that sort of thing. And that, I think, is the crux of, as we move forward, those mechanisms exist, but how do we continue to make sure that they're healthy in the new environment where you don't necessarily have the meetings where people are actually coming together? And that's sort of one of the things that Rolf was touching on in terms of some of the challenges of meeting and what first with COVID and then with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
And I guess this is one of the few times I can come in with my academic background to a social scientist. It's kind of, I would call
actually,
it
I'm trying to convert. Rolf is going to be a social scientist any day now.
She's trying to bring me over to the dark side, you know.
Yep.
So, but I'm resisting, you know. Now, the Arctic Council working groups is more like an ecosystem in many ways. It's not like a rigid body, but it's the interactions that count. So you have quite a flexible organization where you collaborate, but it's not through static silos in that sense, but you task force, you have sequential collaboration for AMAP and ACAP, for instance. We do the monitoring and suggest the policy making, they follow up with action plans and so on. So we have this kind of situation, you have sequential process. We do task forcing, it's a very plastic thing. And coming back again to other organizations, I do find us able to undertake emerging issues very rapidly compared to those. I mean, one thing we did from AMAP's side was in 2018, we decided to work with litter microplastics, which was an emerging issue then. 2 years later, we came with the first report. And that is quite exceptional in that sense. You put together, you have nothing. You nominate the experts, you scope the document, you put forward, I mean, you need to understand the task and the missions of the group. And you put them together, and they were able to come up with a monitoring plan and an overview in just 2 years. And to me, I was so impressed. That is quite astonishing. And we see the same now. I mean, where we really need to act quickly on, we have the questions related to green transition, for instance, rare earth elements, climate interventions, all those emerging issues that comes up so fast. And to have an organization that is able to adapt to those in a very rapid manner, it's really, I mean, it's gold worth in that sense.
So Rolf, whether or not you're an honorary social scientist, we'll leave that as an open question. One thing, Jennifer can answer that, but one thing I think is I'm confident in saying is you're a science diplomat in your role as executive secretary of AMAP. And this is, of course, a concept that's been fashionable for the past 10 or 15 years or so, science diplomacy. And it seems like the Arctic Council, and particularly the working groups, is almost the perfect test case, the perfect laboratory for exploring this concept, particularly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has derailed so much of international cooperation in the Arctic and beyond. Perhaps you can talk a bit about that, how working group level science diplomacy has worked, particularly the last 2 years or so.
I'll explain you why. It's not. It has nothing to do with Fight Club as such. So please relax. Please, I'm afraid I will be quoted on this. And that's where it started. Science diplomacy, in my opinion, works because we deal with science. And a consequence of collaborating, a consequence of meeting and talking and finding common concerns and common solutions builds relationship. And building relationship is building trust. And building trust can be lifted up on a higher level. And then it becomes diplomacy. So that is much how we never gone out and say, like, we will do this because we want to do science diplomacy. We would like to do a human health project in Russia because we want to do science diplomacy. No. We want to do a human health project because we're concerned about human health all over the Arctic. It's not about one state, but it's about equal collaboration. It's about the scientific interest, the scientific relevance, and also what we've seen, for instance, from our work with persistent organic pollutants and mercury, is we can lift it up to the international level, and we can make international regulation which really affects the health of people in the Arctic. And then those doing science diplomacy, they don't think about the diplomacy part. They think about the science part. But what's the consequence of that is the relations, it's the interactions, and it's the trust being built, which turns into diplomacy and gives the basis for the wider discussions that are outside of the scope of my working group, for instance.
So it's like a positive byproduct in some sense.
It is. It's a byproduct, but it was also, it was kind of the intention when it all started. It was genuine common interest of those, of the relevance of the environmental issues in the Arctic, but also it was an understanding that you need to feed this engine. You need to make sure, because there will come something more out of it. It will be a way of building trust, of building diplomacy in that sense.
If I'm, and I think that, so it's a great sort of perspective on the scientist's role in science diplomacy. I think one of the things is, as Rolf touched on, ultimately the Arctic Council is a product of an attempt at science diplomacy. And what's interesting about the Arctic generally is, if you look at a lot of the government-to-government relationships, a lot of it is based on science, environment, sustainable development. Like a lot of the agreements are actually in that sort of sphere. So it has been an ecosystem of institutions that are really based on a value in science diplomacy. I do think that we need to look at there are different motivations for different actors in the system. And I think, given the title of the session, it is worth acknowledging that at the diplomatic level, there was there was a lot of work done to get us to the point where there are 8 Arctic states that are still members are the members of the Arctic Council, and those are conversations we will never know all the details of, but we can say there were a lot of conversations, and we do have to acknowledge in there that so there was a political decision by the 8 states to allow the Arctic Council to continue to play a role in science diplomacy. And you needed that. You needed those guidelines, and they're imperfect and they're simplified in terms of what can happen at the working level, but you needed that. And so ultimately you have to acknowledge that all 8 Arctic states recognized the importance of enabling the continuation of working level work. And I would argue you need to really recognize Norway's leadership in making that happen, because without the regular lines of communication, there was a huge amount of bilateral work that had to happen because there weren't those opportunities to bring everybody to the table in the same way. So there's multiple layers and levels, and the magic of where we are now is that they came together in a particular way that allowed that to happen at this point in time.
She also mentioned that, Jennifer, you also are a science diplomat. You were once the executive secretary of the Sustainable Development Working Group, so you speak from some experience on this level as well. Now, you mentioned this working situation here with the working groups on that level of diplomacy, science diplomacy, you want to call that. Rolf, you're originally, as you mentioned, from a border town on the Russian border with Norway, from Kirkenes. Did that experience growing up there, perhaps dealing with Russian people and scientists and so forth for your whole life. Has that helped you navigate these complicated waters that we're in right now?
You're moving into minefield because I was born in Kirkenes, but I grew up in Tana, and it may be details for you, but back home that's major things, you know. So
just say it louder so that people back
so
home
I'm from
can hear.
Tana, not from Kirkenes.
For the record.
For the record, just in case somebody at home sees it. It does. I mean, I grew up in a place which was during the Second World War. It was liberated by the Russians or by Soviet Union at the time. When the wall came down in 1991, I was living up there, and we had a first busloads of Russians coming over the border, and I experienced all that kind of positivity. I'm from a place where there's a lot of people originally from Russia living in Finnmark, in particular in the eastern part of Finnmark where I'm from. And it gives you an understanding, and I mean, all since the Second World War, people have been aware that those that are on the other side of the border, they're also humans. They do have the same kind of interest, they do have the same kind of concerns, they do have the same kind of weather and environment and so on. So you share some communalities, you share some common interest with them, and you have a dialogue and you have a cultural background built together, and that is, I think that's helpful, and it's always, I mean, there are, of course, these days we should not underestimate the effects of the political situation, and it's really tearing families apart. From my experience, this is my personal experience. I'm not talking about from my role as AMAP Secretary. We should not underestimate that, but still, people are able to talk together and to communicate. And of course, that for me, seeing that, it gives a different story for myself to present when I speak with people also from the Russian side, because I can tell my stories about being to Russia or working together with Russians or playing football with Russians or skiing with them and so on. So it gives a different context, it gives a different spice to the conversation in a sense, which kind of, and again, when we talked about science diplomacy, it's a bit like, you know, building those relations that kind of build trust in the long run.
I'm not sure if we're still under Fight Club rules here or not, but can you say anything about the science diplomacy, the collaboration with Russian colleagues in AMAP at this point? Is that something you're at liberty to talk about?
Oh, I mean, we've been closely collaborating with Russia all the way, I mean, since the very beginning, and it may be a surprise to people, but one of the first things we started to collaborate with Russia on was radioactivity, which is, of course, a sensitive issue due to nuclear capacities and so on. So from the very beginning, we have been collaborating with Russia on topics that may seem sensitive from the political side. And it has worked very well. On some areas, we have seen more engagement than others, like human health, for instance. We have collaborated very closely with Russian scientists. Then, of course, during the pause, it stopped from the Arctic Council side. From the Secretariat side, we're a neutral body, so we communicate with everyone. Every piece of information we sent out to all 8 Arctic states. Every request, every question we got from Russia, we replied to. And we were very, very clear about us not being biased in this situation. For us, AMAP is a scientific organization in many ways. And really, in the Secretariat, we really had to sit down and, because, I mean, you had so many restrictions. You had the Arctic Council guidelines we were talking about. That was just a single set of guidelines. But you have national restrictions. You have funding restrictions from different funding organs. You have institutional restrictions. You have restrictions from some of the publishers, scientific journals, saying we don't want to publish with Russian co-authors. And then, of course, you have all the personal perspectives on top of it all. So for us, we really had to sit down and think, what is the core value of AMAP? And it all boiled down to scientific integrity. And what does scientific integrity mean? It means that you value the contribution of your co-author based upon the contribution of your co-author, not based upon his nationality or gender or religion or anything. And this came very clear to us in our discussion with the experts. So we said, like we were discussing could there be ways of moving our work, for instance, our radioactivity work forward? And they were very clear, like, no, that would be scientific misconduct. You don't leave anyone behind on a paper. You don't take anyone's intelligence, any intellectual property, and steal it and bring it forward and publish it as your own. That would be scientific misconduct, and that would be really harmful for AMAP in the long run. And that would be harmful not only on the expert level, but it would be harmful for our reputation in organs like UNFCCC or WHO and so on. So for us, it's all boiled down to that, those kind of core values, which, again, where we started. What are the core values where we started? Well, it was the scientific integrity, the scientific quality we wanted to bring forward. So it is kind of an historical perspective to this. It is about sticking to core values in a sense. And because they've been so well worth for so long time, we saw that they were also valid now. So under very challenging circumstances.
I mean, if we stay on the scientific frontier, one of the landmark publications for AMAP was the 2004-2005 Arctic climate impact assessment, which I think was really a wake-up call to the whole world. Brought a lot of attention to the Arctic Council. And now you've just released or about to release an update. I'm not sure if it's a direct update or sort of a descendant of the original ACIA. But perhaps you can tell us a bit about the state of climate in 2025 based upon this new AMAP publication.
Okay. If I'm allowed first, because I mean we just started this today with launching our key findings, and also I started my introduction to those by exactly the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, which was launched 20 years ago, and it was led by Dr. Bob Correll, among friends, who passed away just 2 weeks ago, 16th of January, and that's the reason why I'm wearing my GAC, because he was also, I mean, he was really one of those superheroes when it comes to climate research in Arctic, but he was also one of the first that really brought forward the need to bring together indigenous knowledge and as well as science to better understand and adapt and mitigate climate change. So that's why I have this one on today and not the suit. And moving from Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, when we launched the ACIA report, as we call it, in 2004 and a scientific report in 2005, it was, among some experts, considered a bit controversial because it was rather radical. We were more radical in our estimates than IPCC. So it was like, can this be true? Can these guys from these experts, can they actually be more precise than IPCC? Looking back now, we see that if we were anything, we were too conservative. The estimates we had then, we have exceeded those long time ago. When it comes to snow cover, when it comes to sea level rise, and so on. So actually, we were way too conservative then, and this is due to what we call the Arctic amplification. So it's really speeding up. We see now the Arctic is, and this is the findings from a new report. Arctic is warming up 3 times as fast as the global average. Some parts of the Arctic, like the Svalbard, Novi Zemlya area, is 6 to 7 times as fast as the global average. It's really, really fast. You can see the change happening. It's getting wetter. It's getting warmer. We have an increase in extreme events like wildfires, for instance. Not so much from them. We have heard a lot about, and now we're back to science diplomacy again. We heard a lot about wildfires on the Canadian and American side. Wildfires in northeast Russia has quadrupled since 2003. It's really peaking. So it's really, that's really where we see the change when it comes to wildfires. We have some really big challenges ahead. Permafrost thaw. 2/3 of the permafrost in Arctic is located within Russia. It is predicted by 2100 that given the emission ratios we do have now, or emission scenarios we do have now, we will probably have emissions from the thawing permafrost on the size of a larger industrial country, and ICCI say on the size of China or US by 2100. So we do see like a rapid increase. Ocean acidification. Everybody heard about the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. The Arctic oceans are acidifying twice as fast as the global average. So that's really the speed we have. And it's already impacting organisms, already impacting snails, bivalves, juvenile fish species and so on. And it will, in the long run, it will probably impact ecosystem services, food systems, and so on. So it's really, it's happening fast. I came back this week from what we call the Arctic Youth Expedition. We brought 10 youth or 9 youth up with us to Finnmark to ski together with Kristin Harila across there. And we visited reindeer herders. We started up in 7 degrees plus and a storm and rain. When I grew up, that never happened in January, you know. And we heard the reindeer herders saying the same, like, this is completely unusual. During those 3-4 days, the temperature dropped from +7 to -35, which is rather cold when you're 18-year-old and wake up in a tent, as these guys did. But it kind of tells about those rapid changes, the total change in dynamics we see. It is really something else than we had 20 years ago or even before.
I mean, this report 20 years ago, in some ways, I remember it. I mean, it seemed like it was one of the triggers for this idea of a gold rush in the Arctic. This change, environmental changes that will open up resources and shipping routes and so forth. So it seems like it was really an important milestone in the geopolitical sense as well. Nowadays, there seems like there's another new rush to the Arctic and sort of geopolitical concerns, and it's created some other side effects, which, Jennifer, you've been commenting quite a bit upon this latest situation with Greenland and Donald Trump's interest in acquiring Greenland one way or another. Perhaps you can comment on that and how you think this will affect the upcoming Danish chairmanship of the Arctic Council.
Well, I think this is a segment, like there's a whole segment specifically on this topic
in 2 minutes.
coming up. So right after us. I guess what I would say, I mean, I'm struck as Rolf is talking about sort of from +7 to -25, 35, is what we're living in internationally is also a period of real uncertainty and instability. And, you know, this is something that is global in nature. We're seeing because of the situation in Greenland, that's brought attention to the Arctic, and there's no question that the Arctic has become a focal point of some of that. But I really sort of, there's the narratives that we're using in the media around these issues and how they get simplified into sort of the West versus Russia and China and the sort of the rush for resources and I think we need to, especially for those who are actually trying to encourage responsible governance and government in the Arctic context, we need to move beyond those sort of simplified narratives and recognize that, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about are potentials and risks, and rather than sort of imminent. I mean, when we talk about shipping, when we talk about resource extraction, these are all potential things, and there's a lot of questions to be raised around the viability, the environmental impacts, all those kinds of things. And so the sort of escalation of the issues into something I don't think is very good. And so I would say send the same message in terms of this situation in Greenland. I think what we're seeing right now, and irrespective of what the position of the new administration in the United States is in terms of how serious they are, which I think is not, again, not unique. I come from Canada, and I know there's a lot of people talking about that situation as well. So this is, we've got a number of statements that go against the international rule of law. And I think that as an international community, that we need to remember is Greenland has clear foreign policy. It only just came out. It has been very clear in terms of its aspirations and expectations. And so ultimately, I don't think we want to distract, especially the really valuable work that is happening in the Arctic. And I do believe that there's sort of the high politics and drama that is going to play out on one level. But in terms of the Arctic Council, that the Kingdom of Denmark and Greenland and its leadership role that it's going to play in the Arctic Council with this transition need to focus on the work. They need to focus on defining those priorities and as much as possible, and I'm not belittling the situation at all, but really focus on what the policy priorities are for the Arctic and the work that can be done to move those things forward, and let the sort of drama that is unfolding at another level, not infiltrate and be part of that, that narrative of what's happening in the Arctic. That's really important that we try and do that as much as we can.
And as Jennifer mentioned, we'll get back to this question in the next
That's right.
the next session, which will be starting a little later with two other experts. Just as to wrap up, though, you're both obviously very committed to the Arctic Council. You've both been very deeply involved with the Arctic Council.
Drank the Kool-Aid.
Exactly. And I mean, we've talked about a lot of the positive aspects of the Arctic Council in this session here, but it certainly has faced a series of crises, from COVID to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What continuing vulnerabilities do you see in the Arctic Council? What needs to be addressed to make it more resilient as we go forward now?
I'll go.
You start.
So, I mean, I think Rolf touched on it, is that the Arctic Council ultimately depends on an amazing and rich ecosystem of experts. And those experts come from all over the world. And that mechanism, the mechanisms by which the Arctic Council works with those ecosystems or communities or networks of experts is incredibly important, and we can't sort of just assume it's going to happen. Though maintaining those healthy mechanisms take work, and I think that in a world where we're trying to keep things depoliticized, we also need to keep in mind that we need to invest in, and it takes energy, it takes resources. The secretariats have to do, especially in this context, have to do a lot of work in order to maintain those. And we can't sort of underestimate the amount of effort that requires. So that's to me that we don't want to just sort of rest on our laurels and say, aren't we great that we got this far? I do think that focusing on issues, that the Arctic Council continuing to focus on issues that are important to people in the Arctic is incredibly important. That ultimately there are international fora where there will be where there'll be conversations that need to happen at a global level, but that ultimately one of the strengths of the Arctic Council is that it can and should prioritize the issues that are important to the people that live in the Arctic, and to not forget that. So we've seen sort of a reintroduction of a prioritization on the permanent participants in the current context that sort of got lost for a little while, and that needs to continue. And how do we support and facilitate that work? And I really think that they should be playing an even more, a stronger leadership role in a world where government-to-government relations are going to be increasingly challenging. And we can point again to, an election in Canada that is soon to be coming, an election that just happened in the US, instability in Norway. Government-to-government relations in the Arctic are going to continue to be challenging. And so how do we foster the relationships between the institutions that ultimately can keep this work going, the civil society and NGOs and foundations that need and will keep this work going in this context?
I think Jennifer expressed it in an excellent way. If I can add in, if I'm allowed, I'll go a bit more on the aspirational, the personal side actually. I think it's, as you say, like, we can't just rest on our legacy. We have to look forward, and this is actually the time when we are starting up new work, and that's really the challenging thing. And we have to keep our vision straight on what's ahead, what's the future, and sometimes what I would really like to see in the discussion, we often put up like a contrast, like environmental issues or security. I think that's rather naive, because it's not this or that. They are together. If you can speak with people working on the Arab Spring, on the connections between that extreme year and the wheat harvest and the uprising and so on, and to be able to kind of look both what's near you and what's ahead of you. We are not naive. I mean, I grew up close to the Russian border when the war broke out, and this is the personal side of the story, and it's a bit stressful to say to tell, but when the war broke out, my mother called me and was like, "When are you going to send off your children to send them south?" And we were discussing that. It's a rather absurd discussion to have to send away your 2 young daughters away from you, because that was the situation we felt up here. Because we grew up during the Cold War, so we're not naive about what a war actually means. We're not naive about the brutality going on, but I also know that I have to look into the eyes of that daughter which we were discussing to send away in 20, 30 years' time, and tell her why we didn't act on those really major environmental issues, those issues of climate change. Why didn't we act when we knew? For me, it's about, you have to have 2 thoughts in your head at the same time. It's like playing chess. If you only focus on the next step, you will lose in the very end because you have no strategy. If you only focus on the strategy, you will have no pieces left when you get there because you have lost already. So you have to keep both those thoughts alive at the same time. And that's also how we need to act. It's about dealing both with the present as well as with the future in many ways.
Well, thank you both for a number of thoughtful answers. It's been a fantastic discussion. And at this point, we have maybe 5 or 10 minutes for a few questions. We have to make time for the next session, which is starting at 2:30, and have a little pause in between. But Ambassador, question?
Is there a microphone?
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. No microphone. So
all right.
project.
My name is Petter Wormke. I'm Finland's senior Arctic official in the Arctic Council, and this is a fascinating panel to observe because it feels like I'm watching 3 doctors debating my medical records. And the only question that I have to Rolf and Jenny is, what's the most important piece of advice or message that you want to give to the incoming presidency, incoming chairship of the Kingdom of Denmark, and all the 8 senior Arctic officials that try to make the council continue its usual work?
It is, from my side and from our side, I think the message, and we've been discussing this a lot, if there was one single step we would like to see, it would be to have experts meeting, because that is where the innovation is taking place. That is where the work is taking place. And whether I'm allowed to meet the Canadian head of delegate or the Russian head of delegate in person, it matters less. But as long as the experts can sit down and they really, that's a request from them as well. Like the creational process, the innovative process happens when people meet and talk. And that's, for me, that's the most important thing.
Mine would be an extension of that. So I having gone from working in the Secretariat, I now have been adopted into the AMAP community as an expert, although a social scientist expert in AMAP. So
we'll see what we can do about that. Yeah.
So I mean, I guess this is the message I was ultimately, and maybe just to be more concrete, is the experts that need to do this work come from states, and often. Ultimately, in order to do the work that AMAP does and commit to it, need to be resourced to do that work. And so, in a world where there's hard decisions to make, if you believe that a particular assessment that is being done is important, it's literally looking within your own country and finding the experts and then resourcing them to participate in that. To understand that to not have those experts resourced, whether it's through whatever that mechanism is, if they aren't given that capacity, then there'll be atrophy. And so in a world where the political to political isn't able to, what the investment in the Arctic Council can be at that expert level in order to allow that work to continue and ultimately sustain that trust, which has a diplomatic impact, which is to sustain that trust in those relationships that will then be able to re-flourish in a more political context in the future.
I had a fascinating experience too. We were attending the ministerial meeting of the World Health Organization in Europe last summer, and there all the experts, all the members to UN meet. And when you discuss health issues with Russia and Ukraine in the room, anytime Ukraine had an intervention, they were very specific on what was the major threat to health in Ukraine at the time. And that was, of course, followed up by response from Russia. And it was obvious, and it was really a sensitive topic, but still they were able to sit down and discuss and deal with this. And it was, in many ways, it's really absurd to see, but also it's really beautiful to see that even under such conflicting interests, they were able to sit down together and agree upon a declaration for the WHO Europe in that sense. So I think there are some positive signs out there. There are some positive perspectives to look to.
Well, we're not leaving ourselves much time for a pause between this and the next session. It's been such a fascinating discussion. If we want to take one quick question, otherwise we'll take a break and come back in about 10 minutes or so. One quick question there.
Maybe just a quick question for Jennifer. In the Ottawa Declaration and the Reykjavik, they were built on a series of assumptions of kind of an assessment of what the Arctic kind of environment was like. Are there any assumptions that are now wrong 30 years into it that would guide us to maybe make difficult adjustments to make the Arctic, to give the Arctic Council longevity over time?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great question. And I think that that's sort of what I was alluding to in terms of before COVID hit and before the Russian invasion, I think we were coming, and I say we because at the time I was in the institution, we were coming to that crux of, there were some people really pushing an agenda of making it a more formal international organization versus sustaining some of its more flexible elements and maintaining it as a forum. And I think that's fundamentally sort of reflecting on what those assumptions are and how they've changed is an important piece of that. And I think a perfect example is the role of observers. I think that the Arctic Council was created during a time when the Arctic was, and I don't mean this in a derogatory, was a bit of a political backwater. Nobody cared, right? I mean, even the Arctic states weren't particularly interested. It wasn't ministers that showed up at meetings. It was, and the room was like a tiny little meeting room. So just to give you a sense, and that has fundamentally transformed in terms of what's happening. And some of the decisions, like if the mandate, and this comes to the question of the mandate, if the mandate of the Arctic Council is going to expand and include a lot of things like shipping, which has impacts for a broader international community, like fishing, which we know from the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement already sort of acknowledges that there's others that may have an interest, then you need to reflect on what the institution is and either realign the institution to include those that need a say in those policy issues, or accept that the Arctic Council should constrain its mandate to those things that are specific to the Arctic states. It can't claim both simultaneously. That would be my opinion. But I don't think any of those conversations are going to happen anytime soon. Yeah.
Okay, we'll have to leave it at that, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes or so for part 2 of this 3-part session. So thank you very much, Jennifer and Rolf. It's been a really excellent discussion.